Well, I'm very happy to have as my guest here the one and only Mark Dawidziak. Now, Mark and I go back at least 10 or more years. I think the first time we spoke was, I don't know, 2010, 2011, or 12. And Mark is a reporter at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and he writes about television. And I'm a maniac when it comes to watching television. I mean, I should just mention a long, long time ago, I read a book called Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television, written by a former advertising executive who I guess he felt guilty about being in advertising. Jerry Mander, at least, was his pen name or real name. I don't know. And it was basically, his basic argument was the very process of watching television somehow eats away at your brain. And so I always put myself forward as someone who is good evidence that that's not true because I watch a ton of television. So Mark and I have always had a lot to talk about. But although we will talk maybe a little about television, the reason why I invited Mark to come over here and do this interview is I was delighted to read that Mark has a book called A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. And not only that, I found out that Mark is either author or editor of 25 books. And that actually exceeds the number of books that I am author and editor of, which is maybe about 18 or 19. So, I'm now more impressed with Mark than ever. So, welcome, Mark.
Thank you. And Paul, let me just correct one thing, just to let people know, is the journalist is now in the past tense for me because I left journalism in 2000 April of 2020, almost exactly 4 years ago. After a 43-year career of being mostly a TV and film critic for most of those years, so I really didn't have to work for a living most of my working life. And I shifted to just writing, working on books, and this allowed me to really do deep concentration. I signed the contract for the Poe book right before parting company with Daily Journalism. So that is just to make sure that that is in the past tense, which is why you haven't heard from me in four
Well,
years.
good. I'm glad you mentioned that because I have, like, harbored a little bit of resentment that I haven't
Yeah,
been
that's
able
right.
to
Exactly.
write
What happened to Mark? He doesn't call anymore.
exactly.
Your
This,
mother is so worried. You don't call. Uh, and that's it. I mean, it was a great 43-year ride. I mean, it was, again, who gets that? I mean, 43 years as a film and TV critic. That's really being invited to the party. But I always wrote the books in my spare time. The first one was published in 1982, and after it was finished, I said to myself, "Self, we are never going to do this again. We will never write another book while we're working full time at a newspaper. It's just too draining. It's too much." And then I just kept doing it over and over again. I broke that promise to myself constantly. And then in 2020, it was really kind of time to go full time. So this has been a very rewarding transition. I probably should have done it a lot sooner. I kind of got pushed uh, into making a decision which I didn't kind of have the courage to make for myself. And so, now it has been full time freelance writing and book writing, and that's the lifestyle I always wanted. So,
well, it's a great lifestyle. I mean, people often ask me, well, when are you going to retire already? We're sick and tired of you teaching at Fordham. And I always tell them, hey, you can't beat this. I talk about what I like talking about anyway. And, I have an audience. Well, maybe they're not always, in rapt attention, thinking about everything I say, but still, it's a pretty good crowd. So, but like you, I've been teaching for God knows how many years. I mean, actually, I started teaching, I know exactly when, 1975. So I've been teaching in one way or another now going almost on 50 years. But I also find that very conducive to writing because I've always written as I was teaching, and sometimes literally a discussion I'll have with a student in class can trigger an idea, sometimes for a science fiction book, not just for nonfiction. So, yeah, but it is, I'm sure, a lot more work and a lot more hectic work being a reporter and, having to get things in on deadlines. The only analogy of that in teaching actually right now is as a faculty member, you have to get final grades in by a certain day. So it doesn't matter how many papers you have to grade, you have to do it by then. But other than that, there's nothing even akin to the deadlines that journalists have to go through.
I actually got to play professor for about 10 years at Kent State. I was adjunct out there and taught two classes a semester for 10 years. So there was a point in my life where I was kind of spinning four plates at the same time. I was working full time for a newspaper, writing the books, teaching two classes a semester, and also my wife and I have a touring theater company. So, I was like that guy on the Ed Sullivan show, spinning the plates, trying to make sure none of them fell. And you know, it was probably a little crazy. It was probably the last point I probably could have done that. From an age standpoint and energy standpoint. But I know what you're saying. I had just enough um, experience of academia to remember what it was like getting those grades in and grading all those papers, and that they always say, how tough that is on the students, to how finals week is. So it says, I said, how tough is it on the teachers? Nobody ever thinks about the poor teachers. you know, whatever your problem is, it's magnified by 35 people if I'm the teacher. So well, all my sympathies. But you're right. I mean, the thing is that the oldest cliche is that you learn from your students and your students keep you young. That is the truth. That is
Oh, it's
that is
100% true.
you
It's
know
it's 100% true. I mean, I don't know about you, but while we're on the subject of age, honestly, I still pretty much feel like I'm 19. That doesn't mean that I can walk quite as fast as I could when I was 19, but I can still walk pretty fast. And there's an old story about Bertrand Russell. I don't know if you heard it. I think it's true that he lived, I think, to like his early 90s. And like on his 91st birthday, he would always say up until like his early 90s, he still felt like he was in his 20s. So on his 91st birthday, somebody asked him, well, how do you feel now? Do you still feel like you're in your early 20s? And he said, no, not quite as good as last year. Now I feel like I'm maybe in my late 20s.
nice.
So he kept it going for a while.
I don't feel 19. I just act 19.
Well, that's good too.
I just maturity is such an overrated thing. And what I have found is, especially with the writing of the books, is that and this, the sheer amount of concentration that you need, and the sheer amount of time you need. I feel like kind of an aging athlete, is that they're really, athletes always say this, is that, when you start to get into your late 30s, which is old for an athlete, or early 40s, you're never going to be as fast as you were when you were 22. You're never going to have the moves and the reflexes, but you have a lifetime of experience built up, and you have a lifetime of knowing how to do things, and muscle memory built up. So you can't get faster, but you can get smarter. And that's what I have found in writing the books. I've gotten a lot smarter about writing and how you do it, and you get more and more command of your voice the older you get. You just get more comfortable in your own skin. I can't remember what you were Bertrand Russell. I can't remember who said that you know that life is a journey to becoming yourself. And this idea that you do get to know yourself better, and you do, hopefully, if you're paying attention at all, hopefully that's true.
I think it is true.
Hmm.
But apropos of books, let's talk a little bit about your latest book. And in case anyone listening or watching this video didn't know, I not only teach at Fordham University, I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up within walking distance to Fordham University. I spent a lot of time in Poe Park. As a matter of fact, one of my first singing groups originally called the Transits, and then I changed the name to the New Outlook. I came up with both names. We used to sing like on Saturday evenings in Poe Park in the Bronx. And obviously, Poe's cottage was, I wish someone had taken a picture of us singing there. It was right in the background. So I've always been fascinated by him, and of course, I'd read a lot of his work, but just to think about the fact, you look at this little cottage and you think, my God, Edgar Allan Poe actually lived here. And I know the actual physical cottage was moved from one place to another in the
Yeah.
Bronx. It wasn't built there in the first place, but he lived in those confines. So I was especially interested in your book, but what drew you to Edgar Allan Poe in the first place?
Well, Poe's my has always been an author I've carried through my entire life. There's certain writers you discover when you're very young, and we all get Poe in around the seventh grade. That's the wonderful thing about Poe is he keeps getting it reintroduced into curriculum. Um, but Poe and Mark Twain are both writers I've sort of carried through my whole life. But I've kind of built up more of a reputation in Twain scholarship over the years, and playing Twain. I mean, can you tell? I mean, I've been playing Twain for 45 years, and you
You
wouldn't want
look
his makeup.
great.
Yeah, it's just
If you
right. This makeup process is down to about 5 minutes at this point. Which used to take me 2 hours to look like this. Um, but it really came the suggestion to write the book really was not mine. It's because I've got no shortage of ego, as you know. Uh, but I don't have the stones to go to a major publisher and say, you know what, I should be the next person to write the biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Well, who else but me? I don't have it. I wouldn't have had it. But sometimes it does take somebody else to point out the obvious in your life. And in this case, it was an editor at St. Martin's, and I had done the book on the Twilight Zone for them, and it had done pretty well and well enough for us to talk about an option book with them. And so I hit them with what I thought was my best idea. This is the can't miss slam dunk idea. This is going to knock them out. And it not only missed, it missed badly. They were not interested in my can't miss idea. And so the editor countered with an idea he thought would be good for me, and I didn't like his idea. It had no feel for it at all. So I hit him with my second best idea. He didn't like that, and it was that kind of a conversation. This was very friendly, very collegial, but we were getting to the point where we figured we got to table this thing for another day. We're going to have this conversation. This is going nowhere. And we were just about to get off the phone. This was in the fall of 2019. We were just about to get off the phone, and he said, "What about Edgar Allan?" And I said, "Well, what made you say that?" And I said, "I love Poe, and I've got Poe's one of my favorite writers, and I'm fascinated by Poe. But what made you say that?" And he said, "Well, he just seems to check a lot of your boxes." And I said, "Well, how do you figure that?" And he said, "Well, you know, Poe was the father of the modern detective story. You've written a book about a landmark detective character with your Columbo book. Poe is the father of the modern horror story. You've written about major horror subjects like Dracula and the Night Stalker. Poe is a critic most of his working life. You were a critic most of your working life. Poe is a major 19th century American author. You've written books about a major 19th century American author with your Twain books. How does he not check all your boxes?" And I thought, yeah, he's right. Yeah, but then it kind of came down to what kind of book he wanted, and it kind of became clear that he wanted the type of book that we get every couple of years that claims that it has definitively solved the identity of Jack the Ripper. We get that book and there'll be another one, and just hold on, just stand still long enough. Somebody's going to put that book in your hands again.
I think it's Prince Charles. He
Yep.
traveled back in
I
time.
think we're up to like 15
Yeah.
definitive answers on who Jack the Ripper was, but he wanted that type of book that would solve Poe's death. And that's where I kind of said to him, "Look, if that is the kind of book you want, you better go find yourself another lunatic, because this one's driving away. Let me tell you why that book can't be written." And I enumerated is the reason. I said, "Look, there was no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless because nobody really knew how to do autopsies back then. The state of the autopsy doesn't enter the modern era until the Civil War, when we got very good about cutting up bodies. And had they conducted an autopsy, it would probably been done by somebody who didn't know what he was doing, and he would have been using the equivalent of butcher's knives and machetes to do the operation. I said, so that's number one. Number two, there's no death certificate. There's no death certificate. There's no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics. And finally, and most damning of all, there are no reliable witnesses to Poe's death. All of the witnesses to Poe's final days are not only contradict each other, they contradict themselves. They leave behind accounts, including the attending physician, who probably wasn't in attendance very much, John Moran, who left behind 3 accounts, wildly different in detail and tone. He goes so far as to change the time of death. He goes so far as to change Poe's last words. Now, Paul, can you imagine in today's courtroom setting what a lawyer would do to John Moran if they had him on the stand, you know? And he's your principal witness to how Poe died. So for all these reasons, I said, the book you want can't be written, but I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll tell you the book I will write. I'm much more interested in how Poe lived than how he died. So let me do a book that examines Poe's life and uses the mystery of his death as the filter, the framework as to how we examine his life, because that's legitimate. Because Poe, with any biography, biographies logically start where biographies are supposed to start, when somebody is born. With Poe, the discussion of Poe always seems to start at the end. It always seems to start with his death. It seems to be the first thing people ask about. It is, well, how did he die? And it is one of the it is to my mind, it is the greatest literary stage exit in history. I think there are 3 great literary stage exits. First is Moliere, who is a playwright and an actor. And Moliere is dying of tuberculosis as they are premiering his final play. And he's in the play and he's dying and he collapses on stage, and they drag him into the wings and they revive him and they push him back out, and he finishes the play. He finishes the play and then he goes home and he dies. Well, I mean, that's one of the great that's fantastic for a writer who's also an actor. That's pretty good. And then there's Mark Twain, who correctly predicts that, having been born with Halley's Comet in the night sky in 1835, he'll die when it comes back in April of 1910. He says the year before he dies that it'll be the greatest disappointment of his life if he does not go out with Halley's Comet. And he pulls it off. It's Babe Ruth pointing to the spot where he's going to hit the home run. This is a cold shot, and that is a great literary stage. But in many ways, Poe outdoes them all, because Poe dies under, he not only dies with a mystery, he dies under circumstances which would not be out of his place with his 2 greatest literary achievements. He dies under circumstances which are horrific and would certainly not be out of place in one of his horror tales. He lingers, he's out of his head for a good deal of it. And then he also leaves us with a mystery. The father of the modern detective story leaves us with not only a mystery, but a double-barreled mystery, because there's also the missing days. So Poe is in Richmond in the summer of 1849. And at the end of September, he gets on a steamer and it's heading for Baltimore. He's heading back to the Bronx, basically. He's heading back to the cottage in the Bronx. So the steamer takes him as far as Baltimore. He gets off the boat. But even before that, the moment his foot hits the deck in Richmond at the wharf, a curtain comes down, and the next days are completely shielded from view for Twain. No but witness ever came forward to say so much as, I had a conversation with Poe at the railing of the steamer. I passed him on the streets of Baltimore. Nothing until he is found on October 3rd, insensible, not in the gutter, not drunk, but insensible, out of his head, in front of a polling place in Baltimore, in the streets of Baltimore. And he's taken to a hospital and he dies a few days later on October 7th, 1849. So he leaves us with the mystery of how he died. but he also leaves us with the mystery of the missing days. Where was he? What happened to him during these missing days? So this to me is the greatest literary stage exit, because his death reflects his two greatest literary achievements. And how do you pull that one off? It's almost as if a public relations man went to him and said, Poe, the best thing you could ever do is die at 40 and die under circumstances which are going to reflect your stories that everybody's going to love. And I mean, that's what happens. He's only 40 years old, when he dies. And there's a staggering number of theories as to what might have carried him off. And the problem is, because among the people I interviewed for the book were forensic pathologists and medical historians and detectives and FBI agents. And the number one problem, which is you isolate right away, besides all those that I already enumerated, no reliable witnesses and no death certificate, the other major problem is Poe dies under what is called, as best we know, non-specific symptoms. And that means that these symptoms can fit a staggering number of possibilities. Like, we know basically how he's dying. We know that his nervous system is completely shot. We know he is, he's rambling. We know all of these things. But that can be caused by a lot of things. In other words, you can come up with a theory as to how Poe died and bend those symptoms around your theory. And the problem is there is no hard evidence to pin it down to one possible final cause. I did tell St. Martin's, if I come up with a theory that I think is convincing and compelling, even though it has to be largely circumstantial, because it cannot be anything more than that, but if I will put that forth as, my theory as to how he died, and I do arrive at how I think he died, but and I'm very clear on this. I do not insist on it, because it is one thing to say you think you know, and it is another thing to say you can prove it. And I cannot prove it any more than anybody else who can come up with something can prove it. If somebody was to say, I think aliens came down, abducted him for those missing days, put him back down after experimenting on him, and the experiment is what killed him, there's just as much proof for that as there is for anything else. So, and that's not my theory, by the way.
That's not a bad theory. By the way, I have a suggestion for your next book before we continue with Poe. You ought to look into who killed JFK.
Oh my goodness.
That's similar. Obviously not really at all similar to what happened to Poe, but similar in the sense that there are so many different theories and
I've read a great deal on that. I've read a great deal, and I've actually visited Dallas and Dealey Plaza. And I've from high school, I've been fascinated with both the assassinations, and they're both equally interesting for any number of ideas.
what is it?
It's a
What's the
little
other
off subject.
assassin? Yeah, but what's the other assassination other
Oh,
than
at Lincoln. I just
Lincoln? Okay, right,
the two presidential assassinations.
right.
But the thing about the Kennedy assassination, no matter what anybody thinks about the Kennedy assassination, whether you think it was Oswald acting alone, or whether you think it was a conspiracy, whether you think it was the Cubans, whether you think it was the mob, whether you think the government was involved, whether you think LBJ was involved, whatever anybody thinks, the one thing which is undeniable, and that all of the evidence agrees on, because you can't even have this discussion until you agree on this. This was the worst conducted murder investigation in American history. If you told people the details, like, well, Oswald was deposed at police headquarters at Dallas, and there was a transcript of what he said. Why don't we go to the transcript? It's missing. What do you mean it's missing? Where do you even get? If you look at the details of how that whole investigation went on and what was done, and you said, this is not the president of the United States, this is some clerk at a 7-Eleven who was shot, and this was the investigation. You said, this is the shoddiest thing. This is an outrage. This is a scandal. This was the president of the United States. And so you don't even get to the discussion of Kennedy until you have to admit just how it's like the Keystone Cops when you look at this, and even the people who defend the Warren Commission or stick to Oswald have to concede. Well, one of the reasons this is because everybody was blundering back then. You know, this is one of the great crimes. It was not just the crime of the murder of a president in a major American city, but then I mean the fact that they were allowed to leave Dallas with the body,
Well,
which was
everything that
against the
happened,
law. It was
that's right.
against
Well,
the fact that the Secret Service wrestled the body away from
that's
the
right.
local authorities.
But here's what I think the key problem is, which is not very often articulated. First of all, I have never believed the Warren Commission's conclusion, just on instinct, and also because as I got older and read more about it, as you correctly pointed out, the incredibly sloppy, inefficient way the investigation, which, and again, this isn't like the middle of the 1800s where they didn't know what they were doing and forensic science was in its infancy. This was the early 1960s. There were plenty of experts who could have done a much better job. But what makes this an exquisite problem, I've always thought, is why then did the president's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who himself would be assassinated tragically in 1968, why did he go along with that mess? And he was not only the president's brother for a while, he was still attorney general. And I think that all of the various conspiracy theories and probes into the assassination and how the investigation was mishandled. And by the way, apropos of podcasts, I'd recommend the Rob Reiner podcast, Who Killed JFK, to you and anyone. There are about 10 episodes. It came out, well, this past November. It was right around the time of the anniversary of the assassination. But and then when I was reviewing that, I made this point, and I've never gotten an answer to it. There's no doubt that Robert F. Kennedy loved his brother. There's no doubt that it was as horrendous as that assassination was to everyone else. It was even more horrendous to him. And why did he stay silent, for all those years? And I think until we know the answer to that, we're not going to understand why people accepted what the Warren Commission did.
Right, right. I mean, and again, I know just enough to sort of question. I mean, I'm no expert. I don't posit myself as an expert. And as far as the Warren Commission goes, I still say it's one hell of a bullet. To
It is
it just
the
comes
magic
down
bullet.
to, oh my goodness, it changes direction in midair. That is one hell of a shot. So, I mean, it is problematic, at best. But again, I'm no, and this is one that just, you're right. I mean, this is right up there with Jack the Ripper as far as, you know,
Yeah, who wasn't? Just to get back to Poe for a second, and without giving away anything that you talked about in the book, um, do you consider the possibility that Poe was murdered for whatever reason?
well, that was the basis of a book which was written by John Evangelist Walsh in the 1990s. He had come up with this, which is a very good book, by the way, until he gets to the conclusion, because the conclusion, I think, is based on even less evidence than most theories are. And his theory was that when Poe was in Richmond that summer, he reconnected with his childhood sweetheart, Elmira Royster Shelton, and he seemed to have left um, Richmond with an understanding that they were going to get married. Poe's wife, Virginia, died a few years earlier, and he was courting several women in the next few years, and he he seems to have arrived at an understanding with Elmira that they. And so Walsh's theory, presented in the book, was that her brothers followed him when he left Richmond, and not that they meant to kill him, but they did teach him, like, beat the hell out of him and left him, and that he dies from the. And the problem with that is that one of the things we do know about, there's so much we don't know, but Poe's body was examined when he got to the hospital in Baltimore. He was washed and thoroughly examined. if the air had been a beating that severe, there would have been evidence of it. And plus, there's no evidence at all that the brothers ever even left Richmond. You know, if he had come up with a train ticket or something which indicated that these guys were not in town, so and there's no evidence that they felt so strongly about the match that they would do this, that they would, that they would pursue him and try to break up the impending marriage. So it's a very shaky theory. The murder theory is extraordinarily shaky. You know, one of the things I do try to do in the book is I try to knock down some of the existing theories. Like now, one of these existing theories as to how he died, which became very popular in the early 2000s, was that he died of exposure to illuminating gas, the carbon in the illuminating gas, because all the lamps back then were, giving off fumes, and that being a writer and always around lamps and all of this, that Poe was probably, consuming an awful lot of this, and that this undermined his system, and he was basically being poisoned by the illuminating gas. Well, here's one of the few things we can test. One of the few things that we can test from Poe is hair. When people died back then, there was a custom to cut snips of hair and keep it keepsake. So we have a lot of Poe's hair that we do have, and we know that it was taken at the point of his death. So that's a really good. Hair is a good record. Hair is you can analyze hair, and you can even see what people were eating, what their diet was like. You can see an awful lot of what they weren't. So there have been analysis on Poe's hair, and you can test for heavy metals. You can test so the analysis of Poe's hair shows that his levels for illuminating gas was negligible. And the reason probably was Poe got out a lot. He walked everywhere because he was poor most of his life. He couldn't afford a horse and carriage. He couldn't afford that kind of transportation. So he walked, and he loved walking. He walked all through the Bronx back. He used to walk to Fordham to play cards with the priests, with the Jesuits there. So he probably got out. They could also test his wife's hair, Virginia's hair, and Virginia's levels were much higher. Well, she was bedridden. She couldn't get out. So she had much more prolonged exposure to the illuminating gas. So, can you rule out illuminating gas? No, but you can, it doesn't sound, it's like the murder theory. It doesn't really hold up. You squash it. Rabies was a popular theory for a while, was that, um, well, there was no evidence of a bite wound, and rabies can take a while to show up. I mean, so there could have been a bite that healed or something like that, and the rabies went active. But even more damning to the rabies idea is it's again one of the few things we know for sure. Poe's in the hospital for 3 or 4 days before he dies. He takes liquids. He's given bouillon. He's given water. He's given coffee. If he swallowed one thing, it wasn't rabies, because once you get the rabies is that far advanced, it's hydrophobia. You foam at the mouth at the very idea of swallowing water. So if he took one swallow of water, and it's clear he did, it's probably rabies. So one of the things I do in the book is I work through a lot of the existing theories, and without being able to discount completely anything, try to sort of look at the probabilities, and also build the case for this. See, we're up to about 25 theories as to how Poe died. So I treated the 25 theories as 25 suspects. Now, if you're conducting an investigation, if you're a detective conducting an investigation, you are going on opportunity and means, and because most of these things wouldn't have motive, because rabies doesn't have motive, so your motive is out. So you have to look at means and opportunity as your two major factors here. Which ones had the most means and opportunity to get him? So certain things are going to keep coming back into the room as our primary suspects of interest or people of interest, and there's a couple that just keep coming back in the room, and then some you're going to say, we've looked at this, and the probability says rabies, you go home. We don't want you to keep coming back and murder. Go out, go away. You know, illuminating gas. Mm-mm. But there are certain things in his life, and you look at the pattern of his life, and you look at the what had the most means and opportunity, and you very quickly come up with two or three really interesting, intriguing persons of interest.
That's that that's fascinating. By the way, I just want to mention a couple quick things. I don't know if you saw just in the last few days, and it's received a lot of coverage. They did a DNA analysis, not a DNA analysis, a forensic analysis on Beethoven's hair, and they discovered what they now think is the cause of his deafness. It was lead poisoning
Right.
because as you were saying, they found incredibly high amounts of lead in his hair.
Hair is a great
So,
record. Hair is
yeah,
a fantastic
it
record.
is.
There's somebody that I interviewed for the book is one of the leading analysis hair analysis guy. He's and he's at, of all places, the University of Virginia, which Poe attended uh, briefly. His name is Stephen Macko, and he's called the Hair Detective, and he has done George Washington's hair. He's done several analysis, and he did analysis on Poe's hair. So he was one of my key. See, that's one of the things about the book, which is atypical of biography, because one of the things I told St. Martin's right off the bat is, all right, you're asking me to write this biography. You know that I am not truly an academic, and I am not, and you can't pretend to be a different kind of writer than you are. And I said, so this biography is going to be a working writer's view of a working writer. That's what you're going to get. And I was a journalist for 43 years. I am going to bring the skills of a journalist. Journalists interview people. Like I used to interview you when I was doing a story and I needed an expert on something. So, but I was also, again, like a detective on the case, and detectives interview witnesses. Well, who can your witnesses possibly be for somebody who died in 1849? In my case, the witnesses are Poe scholars who have studied minute aspects of Poe's life and career, uh, medical historians who could tell you what conditions were like in the 1830s and 40s, what could it have been, what couldn't have been, forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists, police detectives, FBI agents. These were my witnesses. And I went to them and I interviewed them. Their voices are throughout the book. And because I wanted it to be a very alive book, even though the book uses death as a framework, I wanted these very alive voices, almost like a documentarian would do. So, I mean, that was one thing. And the other chance I took with the book was it has an alternate timeline. The two timelines bounce between the last 4 months of Poe's life, these increasingly desperate 4 months when clearly things are going off the rails for Edgar Allan Poe. So you bounce between that and the different sections of his life until those two timelines meet at the end, and you get my theory as to what killed him.
It sounds like a fascinating book. By the way, your approach of eliminating the theories that don't work, that also, of course, was the approach of Sherlock Holmes. You eliminate everything that's not the case, and then however improbable it is, whatever's left standing, that's the solution. And that's also the essence of Karl Popper's philosophy of falsificationism. You can never prove anything 100%. If you see 1,000 white swans, that doesn't mean that all swans are white because the very next swan you see might be purple. But as soon as you see that next purple swan, you know that all swans are not white. So we learn by falsifying things. That is by showing what's definitely not the case, and then what's left, who knows, that could later be falsified, but it still is at least closer to the truth than what's been disproven and rejected.
That's exactly right, and it's not only very Sherlock Holmes like, it's very Poe like, because Poe himself fancied himself quite the detective. He was a problem solver. He would challenge people to send him puzzles and codes, and he was very good at deciphering and cracking these. And Poe, of course, comes up with the character who is the direct role model for Sherlock Holmes. He creates the character of C. Auguste Dupin, who only appears in three short stories, the best of which is The Purloined Letter. Um, but he is a direct role model for Sherlock Holmes. How do we know he's the direct model for Sherlock Holmes? Because Arthur Conan Doyle told us that. And there's this wonderful moment in the 1890s where Sherlock Holmes has become all the sensation and the stories have become. And Doyle visits America, and he lands in America, and the American reporters are waiting for him. They're lurking, and they're going to get this guy. And so they have this press conference, and one of the reporters, probably Mike Wallace's ancestor, says to him, well, isn't it true? Isn't it true that your Sherlock Holmes is just a knockoff of C. Auguste Dupin? And Doyle shocks them all by saying, yes, absolutely. It all goes back to Poe. He gives Poe full credit. And a few years later, in 1909, on the 100th anniversary of Poe's birth, there's this big banquet in uh, in London, and all of the leading literary lights are at this banquet, and Doyle gives the keynote address that night, and it's in Poe's honor, and he famously asks, "Where was the detective story before Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" And it goes even further than that because John Douglas, the FBI, the father of modern profiling at the FBI, he actually credits Poe with being not only the father of the modern detective story, but modern forensics. Because he said, Poe is the first one to sort of look at things, profile, look at things logically, and look at things, he's applying logic to detective work, and he's formalizing it in a way. So Douglas actually gave him credit for much more than just the detective story. So not to use that for that book would have been derelict of duty because it is exactly what Poe would have done.
I love that. And, this is, of course, part of a larger um, situation in which it's often thought, and it's not completely incorrect, that people who write fiction rely on facts and nonfiction, which is true in and of itself. But what's often missed is that the greatest scientists sometimes get their inspiration from fiction. So, I mean, an example that I always cite is Isaac Asimov. You have someone like Paul Krugman, a Nobel laureate in economics, saying that Krugman, got interested in these grand theories of economics after reading Asimov's original Foundation trilogy. Or you have Marvin Minsky, the late, unfortunately, AI scientist and professor at MIT, and he says, well, Minsky got interested in AI and robots after reading Isaac Asimov's robot stories. So it's good to hear that Poe, like Asimov, had that impact. But as long as we're at this time in history, the 1890s, let's talk a little bit about Mark Twain, which obviously you're very interested in. Twain has always been one of my all-time favorite authors for a variety of reasons. Time travel is, along with alternate history, is both my favorite thing to write, my favorite thing to read, and I'll throw in a third thing, my favorite thing to watch, either on television or in movie theaters. And of course, H.G. Wells properly gets a lot of credit for sort of launching the public's interest in time travel with the Time Machine. So that's published in 1895. But what's often overlooked is Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. That's 1889. And people, of course, are aware of that, but I have rarely, if ever, seen Twain credited with, hey, you really helped start the time travel genre.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Connecticut Yankee is often overlooked as an important sci-fi book, because nobody thinks of Mark Twain as a science fiction writer. But Twain, if you look at some of the later writings, where Twain imagines, uh, vast journeys in microbes under a microscope and these ships and this. I mean, he had a mind which kind of went that way. both something that he and Poe both share is they were both incredibly prolific and versatile writers. And if you look around 1960, probably the two most famous American writers going into the 1960s. When I say famous, I mean instantly recognized, and it's still true today. Are Mark Twain and Edgar Allan Poe, sort of black and white, and both their reputations rested on a stereotype. You know, for Twain, it was this kind of avuncular, grandfatherly man of letters, the family author, the genial wit, sort of the missing link between Ben Franklin and Will Rogers, and it was a an image fiercely protected by his one surviving child, his daughter Clara. You know, and there was this whole pile of suppressed writings, which Clara was sure would destroy her father's reputation if they ever got out, because they had very bitter things to say about religion and politics and what he called the damned human race. And when Clara dies, these suppressed writings start to come out. 62, we have the publication of Letters from Earth, and quite the contrary. They didn't destroy Twain's reputation; they enlarged it. Twain keeps getting bigger and bigger in the 60s, and that wonderful era, that wonderful decade. And all of a sudden, people realize Twain is this important social critic, that he had all of this incredible stuff to say. Sadly, Poe is every bit as popular when he comes out of the 60s, but he's the same guy. Poe is still kind of our grandfather of goth. He is our, master of the macabre. He is, our sultan of the supernatural. And the truth is, very little of what Poe wrote was actually horror. It's very good. What he wrote was landmark. It is a reason we're still reading those stories is because he was so good at it. But when Poe's collected writings were put together in the early 20th century, they spanned 17 volumes. Now, even for a man who only lived to be 40, 17 volumes, and that much of it is horror. And this, one of the reasons I wrote the book was the stereotype of Twain has somewhat been demolished, and we kind of, accepted that there's a lot of Mark Twains there. There is the guy who wrote Connecticut Yankee, who dabbled in science fiction and time travel. There is that social critic. There is, there are all these Mark Twains. With Poe, we still want to keep him in that little box and say, well, this guy was a horror writer first, a mystery writer second, and a poet third. And Poe wrote as much humor as he did horror. We just don't read the humor today. He had a great sense of humor. We deny Poe a sense of humor, and we've made him the kind of this grotesque caricature. And Twain was that. And I think people are a little afraid of losing the fun Poe. I think they're afraid if we accept the fact that Poe was this very serious, dedicated artist and working writer, he wasn't this madman up in an attic spinning out stories while, drunk off his ass on cognac. This was a very, very dedicated artist. And once you accept that, once you sort of accept the real writer who wrote those stories, you're not going to lose the fun guy because he was too good at the other stuff. It's any more than we lost the fun Twain. When we accepted that there was more to Mark Twain and Mark Twain was allowed to get bigger and bigger, it's not like we lost that other Mark Twain because of that. And we're not going to lose the other Poe because, I mean, this was really one of the main reasons I wrote the book was I wanted to really smash that funhouse mirror reflection of Poe that we have had almost since the day he died, almost since the moment he died. This is a guy who has been buried under myth and misconception and mystery. And he wasn't who most people think he was. I just one thing, he was athletic. Nobody thinks of Poe. Everybody thinks of Poe as sickly. And he says, he'd been in the military. He'd risen as far as he could as a non-commissioned officer. He was a good soldier, and he never lost that military bearing. He walked with his shoulders back with a military gait, and he walked everywhere. And he could win any jumping or leaping contest. He was a good boxer. He was. Well, nobody thinks of Poe as athletic. Everybody thinks, oh, what's your image of Poe? Poe, sallow-eyed, pale skin, sickly. That's the
Yeah.
character.
Well, absolutely. And, in terms of what you said before about his walking from his home to Fordham University. I've done that many times myself.
Hmm.
Um, I'm
And he
too
walked the
cheap.
other way. He
Yeah,
walked the High Bridge. He walked over the aqueduct and go
yeah,
into
yeah,
Manhattan that way.
yeah.
He would walk everywhere.
That's one of the reasons, by the way, why I sort of flirt a little bit with Poe in my latest novel, the It's Real Life and Alternate History of the Beatles, in which there's a mention of Poe's cottage, and there are tunnels under Fordham, and somehow did Poe have something to do with that? But a major section of the story also takes place on that wonderful aqueduct, which I recommend anybody who's in that area of the Bronx go for a walk on that aqueduct. I mean, Doctor, just you're right up there on Fordham Road. You got to walk past the Jerome Avenue line, keep walking, further west, and then you can just walk on this amazing aqueduct. But getting back to Twain for a second, I did want to mention about Twain. One thing I've always admired and actually loved about Twain is he was not shy about acknowledging that he loved fame. He didn't go through this act of, oh, I'm so modest, don't ask me. He would love walking down Fifth Avenue in his white suit, which of course Tom
Well, the
Wolfe
reason he
picked up
wore
on.
it was
Yeah,
it drew attention to him.
that's
He
right.
wore it year round at the end. And yes, no, no. Mark Twain was. I remember he goes to on the platform when he starts to make it as an author. He's kind of the leading stand-up comedian of his day. Mark Twain was a ham. There's no other way to say it. He was called the most conspicuous man on the planet, and he reveled in that. There's stories of him where he would walk into the lobby of a hotel, and if everybody didn't turn around and recognize him, he would walk out and walk in at another place where everybody could see him walk into those. And said, "Oh, it's Mark Twain!" And not without cause. I mean, one of my favorite stories about Mark Twain was that at one point somebody wrote him a letter and it was addressed Mark Twain somewhere in the world. It got to him. The letter was delivered to
I
him.
love it.
That's how famous he was. That's how, it was a fame that just nobody can. I mean, Poe struggles in his life. He's not really even known as a short story writer, or he's known as a critic. He's known as a literary critic in his lifetime. Twain achieved a level of fame. Dickens achieves it certainly in the 19th century. But he achieves a level of fame. And, Thomas Edison once said that, an American loves his family. If he has any love left over, it's usually reserved for Mark Twain. Now, that's a great quote. This is a wonderful quote, but it just shows how, and it's interesting because when you get into that first decade and his last decade, because he dies in 1910, that first decade of what is called the American century, um, he and Theodore Roosevelt are really tussling over the spotlight. They utterly were charmed by each other when they met each other. They couldn't help but be charmed by each other. But they hated each other's politics, absolutely despised. And they were both right, by the way. They're both right and they're both wrong. I mean, it just was a matter of perspective. Both of them were all for the battle to liberate Cuba. There was no question that they wanted the Spanish out of there and that the atrocities in Cuba had to end. And so they were both in favor of liberating Cuba. The second it became an American possession, the second the Philippines became it, Twain turned because Twain was an anti-imperialist to his heels. And Twain basically said the American eagle should not be putting its talons on other parts of the globe. That's the monarchs of Europe. That's what those guys do. He's right. I mean, he from a philosophical standpoint, this is a very pure thing. But from TR's standpoint, TR's thinking if America is going to take its place on the world stage, it needs a navy, and if it needs a navy, it needs bases, which means it needs possessions. So TR is thinking the guy who wrote as his thesis at Harvard the history of the naval battles of the War of 1812, he understands that the American Navy is got to grow, and if it's going to grow and have a real influence, we need places. We need places around the world. So he's right. You know, you can look at both of their viewpoints and say, two things can be right at the same time. And so and TR hated Twain for being an anti-imperialist, and Twain hated TR for being an imperialist. And but you also have the fact that probably they're battling over who's going to be the most conspicuous American at the same time. There's probably also you have two tremendous egos and hands here with TR and Twain. So it's an interesting that they kind of represent the battle for the American soul in that first 10 years, in that amazing first 10 years.
Well, it's good that you say that they're both right because all too often, we live in a world in which it's thought there can only be one right answer, and sometimes even contradictory things can be right. But actually, that reminds me of an old Yiddish joke about there's like a knock on the rabbi's door late at night. He opens the door, he sees a man, he's very upset. He says, "Come in, what's the matter?" He says, "Oh, I can't take it anymore, Rabbi. My wife is driving me crazy. She's a terrible cook. She doesn't take care of our kids." And the rabbi says, "Look, everybody knows your wife, let's face it, she's not the best mother. She's not a very good wife, but you just have to try to put up with it. You didn't make the best choice in marrying her, but just try to stay with your marriage." And the man says, "Okay, Rabbi, I'll try." 5 minutes later, there's another knock on the door. Who's there? The very wife of this guy. And she's very upset and crying. And the rabbi said, "What's the matter? Come on in." And she says, "Oh, it's my husband. He's unfaithful. He fools around with other women. He doesn't bring in enough money. He's driving me crazy. He gives me no help with the kids." The rabbi says, "Okay, look, I understand. Everybody knows your husband's a little bit of a philanderer. He's not a very good man. I'll tell you the truth. You're a good woman. You're completely right to be upset about this. Just try to stay with this for the sake of the kids and your marriage." And she says, "Okay, Rabbi." Rabbi closes the door, walks back into the kitchen, and who walks in from another room? The rabbi's wife. And his wife says to the rabbi, "What kind of rabbi are you? A guy comes here and tells you how terrible his wife is. You say that he's right. Then a few minutes later, the wife shows up. She tells you completely the opposite story. You say she's right. How can they both be right?" And the rabbi looks at his wife and says, "You know what? You're right too." So,
But that's
yeah,
there's a lot of wisdom, as there often
yeah,
is in Yiddish humor. There's a lot of wisdom,
that's
and
right.
one of the things that is I again not original to me, but the fact that you're not cannot really be in a mature relationship. You cannot be in a mature, a real citizen of your country until you understand that two things can be right at the same time.
That's right.
That is something that once you sort of accept that, it makes relationships a lot more easy. And
Yeah.
right now we live at a time when everybody is absolutely convinced there is only one truth. There's only one way of looking at something, and the other cannot be true. And
Yes,
when you
that's
can't do
dangerous.
that, you can't compromise, and if you can't compromise, you can't have a relationship. You can't have any kind of
That's
so
completely right.
yeah. So
Let's wrap this up. And if you feel comfortable about this, can you tell us anything about the next book that we can expect from you?
I could, but I'd be wrong. And I'll tell you, I have never been right yet. Since 1982, when the first book was published, and people said, "What's the next book going to be?" And at that point, I said, "Oh, I know what the next book is going to be. It's going to be this." I've been wrong every single time. The universe is much smarter than I am. The universe sort of pushes me in the right. When I stand back now and look and say, "Oh, there was a real pattern here, but I didn't see it." You know, right now I have three proposals with St. Martin's right now to be the next book. It would be a fool's errand to choose which one is actually going to. As a matter of fact, I just had this conversation with my editor. Um, I said I am not going to get emotionally committed to one because as soon as I do, that will be the one you don't choose. So I'll let fate decide this. I love all three ideas. I love all three, so, but I'm going to sit back and let fate decide this one. And I'm also even ready for the fact that it will be none of the three. That they'll come back to me and say, we've been thinking like this discussion with that editor who said, "What about Poe? If it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have pursued that." So Um, I'm not trying to be coy about this. I'm not trying to be, I do know that right now, the next book, as I'm revising my book about the Night Stalker, about the Carl Kolchak character, and I'm aiming for the fall for that. That's what I'm working on right now. But past that, we'll see. I'm going to put it down to we'll see because um, I'm superstitious as hell when it comes to this. And like I said, if I say, you know what, I think they're going to go for this one, that's the kiss of death right there. That's to be assured that they don't. You know, So I've just been counted myself lucky that there has been another book, all the way from the fact when the first book was published, and at that point I always said sort of thought like, well, it was one. There's no guarantee there'll be two. You enjoy them as they come. They're all wonderful rides that take you in wonderful places, and you make that's what my number one advice to all young writers that I encounter is enjoy every part of the process, enjoy every part of the journey. You know, I'll give you an example of that. Is that 1989, my book on Columbo was published, and it did very well, and it was in print for 10 years. It had a 10-year run, and it was a nice steady seller for 10 years. And then after 10 years, I got the letter, the remainder letter from the publisher saying, we decided to put the book out. The book is being remaindered, you and I thought, oh, well, geez, being remaindered. And then I thought for a second, I said, wait a minute, wait. The only people who get remaindered are real writers or real authors. You don't. And then I thought, hey, I got remaindered. That's enjoy. You can even enjoy that part of the process. It means you did something. It means you had, so I always say enjoy every part of the ride that you get, because you don't know how many copies you're going to sell. I mean, that's all mystical stuff, you know. I've worked years and years on books which have sold, nothing, which got dropped into the pop culture lake and sunk right to the bottom without making a ripple on the surface. And I've had books which, like the Poe book, which has surprised me, beyond. I've never thought it would get the reception that it has. So and that's a lot of your power. It's all out of your like I said, some books come along at the right time, and timing is right there, and it's perfectly placed. That editor knew more than I did when he said it's time for a new biography of Poe. He knew. He knew that the timing was right. So, you know, your only, uh, you know, goal in all this is to enjoy it.
I agree completely. I
Is
agree completely. And by the way, all of us who have had books remained that are in good company. I first learned about that. I organized a conference with Marshall McLuhan a couple of years before he died in the late 1970s, and he came down to the conference with like and his son Eric came with him, and he brought like a whole bag of his latest book, Take Today, the Executive as Dropout, which, by the way, in my view, in case anyone is interested, I think is at very least his third best book. His best books being The Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media. But anyway, so at the end of the conference, I go up to Marshall and I say to him, so do you want me to set aside a little time? So, you want to sell this book here? I'm sure your publisher would be happy. And he says to me, my publisher doesn't care what I do with the book anymore. I brought these books along for you as a present to give out to students who you feel are deserving. And I said at the time, I didn't know that much about publishing. What do you mean? He said, well, the book's been remaindered. And I was like astonished. A book by Marshall McLuhan is remaindered. And that's what I did over the years. It was like 25 copies of the book. And, I was very careful who I gave copies to. But unfortunately, I have no copies of that left. But you're completely right. And by the way, we're also in good company as far as some books just dropping into that quiet lake. The way David Hume put it, his essay on human understanding, that might not be the exact title. It's considered one of the great books in philosophy about empirical philosophy and why you need evidence, et cetera, et cetera. And as he put it, the book was born, stillborn, from the press, and nobody ever heard of it. So in his lifetime.
Yep.
So, that's what we have to go through, but it's you have to enjoy every moment of it indeed.
You do, and you have to understand that it's about continuing to take swings. Is that you hit for average. It's like it is like baseball. It's like I have, I'm sure like I have back in the day when we actually had filing cabinets, but filing cabinets and now flash drives full of ideas which were every bit as good as the ideas that did sell. You know,
Yeah.
uh,
So
but for one reason or another, never could find a home, never could find a publisher, and so you keep swinging. You basically you don't just get a rejection and you say, oh well, I'm done. They didn't like it. Too bad. I'm done with this. You know, you've got to keep on going, and if you can sell 3 out of 10 of your ideas, it still means 7 of them are going to stay in that filing cabinet, but 300's getting you to the Hall of Fame, folks. That's a batting
yeah,
average, which is gonna, and that's true in writing too. You know,
100%. And if you get turned down by every publisher, and Robert Heinlein said something similar to this, uh, don't give up, because sooner or later one of the publishers will get a new editor. You can send it back to that new editor. So
absolutely,
there's always a possibility
that's
to do
right.
that. So listen, one thing I'm really sure of, though, apropos about not being sure whether a book sells or not, and all this uncertainty, one thing I can commit to 100% is I would love to interview you when your next book comes out, because this was a delightful conversation. I learned a lot, and it was a pleasure talking to
Well,
you.
you'll be in the loop, believe me.
All
So,
right, good. Take care.
okay, thank you, Paul. It's been
Bye
fun.
bye. Bye bye.